part 2 of our screencast is going to focus on the Civil War itself and kind of all different facets to the Civil War. So first thing I want you guys to take a look at is if you look at this map, this is really highlighting to you some of the different regions of America at the time, and it's showing you who leaves the country and joins the Confederacy and who decides to stay in the Union. So if you notice here, there's 2 shades of red. The lower South is going to leave the Union after the election of 1816, after Lincoln's election. The light red states, some of these upper Southern states, they do not leave the Union and join the Confederacy until the firing upon Fort Sumter, and that prompts the upper Southern states to leave and join the Confederacy. The states in blue remain in the Union, and so do the states in yellow. Now, why the states in yellow are highlighted, these are the border states. And these states, what makes them unique is that the border states have slavery, but they remain in the Union. And I think this is an interesting and important dynamic to the Civil War. It's not just free states against slave states. You do have some slave states that remain in the Union. And so this kind of adds another more complicated element to the Civil War. And because of that, I think part of the main objective of the Civil War in the beginning, according to Lincoln, is not really necessarily to abolish slavery or to get rid of slavery in the nation. It's to preserve the Union. Part of that is to not alienate the border states, and part of that is to gain popular support behind the war to have this undertaking to keep the Confederacy in the Union and force them back into the Union. Now, going into the war, the North is going to have a ton of advantage over the Confederate states. So when you look at Northern advantages, the North has advantages in basically every single area, and if you look at these, some of these should really stand out to you. A lot of these are production advantages. So the North has huge production advantages over the South. We also have huge advantages in infrastructure, like railroads and canals, that can help to facilitate movement of troops. The North also has a huge advantage in population, which can also, can be taken advantage of militarily as far as number of troops and the amount of losses that the militaries can take during the Civil War. And so going into this war, the North really has a big advantage over the South. Now, during the war itself, the direction of the war is going to change a bit. So slavery is always kind of looming over the Civil War itself, but in the beginning, as we said, Lincoln kind of makes it clear that the war is fought to preserve the Union. But in 1863, Lincoln is going to kind of change the direction of the war a little bit by issuing a doctrine called the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is an executive order that Lincoln is issuing. And what it did was, in theory, it freed all the slaves in the Confederate States. Now, in practice, it doesn't really free the slaves in the Confederate States because, the Union Army is going to have to conquer the South in order to free these, slaves. But what it did was it kind of signaled to the American people, to the rest of the world, and to the South what the war's direction was going to take in the remaining 2 years of the war. So at the time, the South, the Confederacy, is really trying to advocate to get Britain to be their ally. And what Lincoln does here by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he makes it very difficult, if the British were considering being allies with the Confederacy, to become allies with them, because he frames the war now as a war to end slavery within the country. Now, he carefully does not, because he doesn't have the authority to do it, abolish slavery in the border states. So that takes an amendment to the Constitution, which is the 13th Amendment, which is passed towards the end of the Civil War, to actually abolish slavery in all of the border states as well. Another potential reason for this is that Lincoln is trying to increase morale on the northern side and give new life to continue fighting. And so, volunteers of troops have been declining at this time. So Lincoln's trying to instill another reason to fight for this war, or in this war. It also could be a reason, another alternate reason could be to get a new supply of troops, that hopefully slaves will be inspired to run away from the South, which will hurt them economically and take away a labor source, but also potentially a base of soldiers for the Union. And so like there's multiple reasons for why the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and it definitely kind of changes the focus and the course of the purpose behind the Civil War. Now, during the war itself, a lesser talked about element to the Civil War is what's happening domestically and Lincoln's expansion of presidential power. So Lincoln really kind of does expand the president's power here, and he also limits people's rights during the Civil War. So famously, one right that he's going to limit is the right of habeas corpus, is really kind of the combined right of a speedy trial and also having the right to be accused of your crime and not being allowed to be kept in jail kind of indefinitely. Now, Lincoln kind of does this because he knows that there's a lot of pro-Confederacy advocates in the border states in different parts of the North that he wants to really kind of put in jail before that they could do harm to the Northern military effort or Northern society. He also is going to kind of limit freedom of the press to a certain extent. So a lot of his political enemies are going to be very critical of Lincoln for doing, some of the things that he does during the Civil War. And Lincoln will make the argument, as many presidents and the government will at times, that it's necessary during a war to kind of limit people's freedoms in order to be victorious and to have a united front to win a war. Now, some other examples of the expansion of the power of the federal government during the Civil War would be the draft that's instituted by the federal government. So both the Confederacy and the Union have drafts during the war. Now, both are contentious to a certain extent. The North is going to see a bigger backlash to the draft. So this is instituted in 1863. And in 1863, in response to the draft, you're going to have massive draft riots break out in New York City. So one of the elements of the Civil War draft that gets a lot of anger towards it is going to be the fact that you as someone who has some money can kind of buy your way out of being drafted. So you could buy a replacement, a substitute for the draft. If you had, I believe the number, I can't remember the number off the top of my head right now, but I believe it was $300, and you could buy a substitute to take your place. And so like a lot of working class Americans were very angry about this. And so you have massive draft riots that kind of break out in New York City, and they rage for 4 days, across New York City. And they're so bad that they have to bring the soldiers from Gettysburg back to New York City to stop the draft riots from taking place. So they did kind of see it as an expansion of the federal power gone too far. And so you kind of see some of this backlash in certain elements of what's happening here during the Civil War. Now, during the war itself, the two famous generals that you want to associate with the Civil War are Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. So Grant is the famous general on the Union side. Robert E. Lee is the famous general on the Confederacy side. And Grant starts his career in the Civil War out in the Western theater. And he wins a lot of victories out in the western part of the war, and he does so well that Lincoln decides to move him into the Potomac theater, where Robert E. Lee is kind of leading his military and leading the Confederacy. And that's where Grant and Lee are really going to kind of square off here in the years of 1864 and 1865. Now, Grant is going to kind of employ a strategy known as the policy of attrition. And really what he does is he uses some of those advantages we talked about that the North has to try and wear down Lee's ability to fight. And essentially what he's doing here is he's using the fact that the North has more soldiers and is able to replenish their soldiers much quicker than the South can do and the Confederacy can do, and also like their superior kind of industrial capacity. And both of those combined are what's able to kind of wear down the Confederacy and able to give Grant and the Union a victory here in the Potomac and ultimately in the Civil War. And so Grant becomes kind of famous from the Civil War and is able to use this fame to launch himself into the presidency during Reconstruction. Now, at the same time, once Grant is moved from the Western Theater into the Potomac Theater, a general named Tecumseh Sherman is left in charge of the West. And what Sherman does is his whole military objective is to cut off the lower South from the upper South, and then as Grant is trying to push south from Virginia, Sherman is going to try and push north up through Georgia and South Carolina to try and squeeze the Army of the Potomac and to defeat the Confederacy. Now, what Sherman does on his march becomes the thing of infamy in the South. And so, like, as he's marching across Georgia, Sherman kind of leaves a path of destruction. And he leaves this path of destruction as he kind of marches up the coast as well. And you kind of see this shown in one of Matthew Brady's photographs of some of the decimated parts of the South. Now, Sherman kind of had a secondary objective here, which was not just to militarily cut off the lower South from the upper South, but to really kind of strike fear into Southerners and to make them quit and to kind of sap their will to fight through his march to the sea. And combined with what's going on in the Potomac, this kind of really, leaves the South with a lack of ability to keep retaining and keep fighting in the Civil War. Now, towards the end of the Civil War, Congress is going to take the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's issuance of trying to end slavery just in the Confederacy and expand it to the entire nation. And that's when they passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which bans slavery within the entire nation. So we often lump this in with Reconstruction, and it's kind of a Reconstruction Amendment. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are Reconstruction Amendments, but it's really happening towards the end of the Civil War itself, is when the 13th Amendment is actually in the process of being written and passed. Now, at the end of the Civil War, really days after the Civil War is officially over, Abraham Lincoln is going to be assassinated. And what this leaves the country with is a new president kind of going into Reconstruction, which is Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president. And when we talk about Reconstruction in our upcoming screencast with Section 5, you're going to see a lot of different potential ideas. Johnson does not see eye to eye with Congress about how to proceed with Reconstruction. It's not clear exactly what Lincoln would have done. Lincoln came up with this idea called the 10% plan, and Johnson kind of bases a lot of his ideas off that plan. It's not clear if Lincoln would have adjusted that or how Reconstruction would have went had Lincoln been in charge of it. But Reconstruction becomes very contentious for the country, not to mention the fact that this is, incredible tragedy for the nation, and kind of further shows that even though the war is over, there is still bitterness and deep divisions between the Confederacy and the Union and the North and the South in the country. And this kind of idea of sectionalism in a lot of ways does continue during Reconstruction and even beyond until the country can kind of fully heal. So when we pick up with time period 5, we're going to take a look at Reconstruction and kind of what's happening during this time period and what changes are being made for the nation, what changes are being made for the newly freed men in the country, and how the nation tries to heal itself and bring itself back together.